Hey, my name's Latoya Jones, and I'm a part of the Seacoast church family, and probably by my name you can guess that I'm Black. While in D.C. a few years ago, my son and I visited Dr. King's Memorial, as well as the Museum of African American History. But it was not until we visited the Lincoln Memorial, and my son and I stood in the exact same spot where Dr. King made his I Have a Dream speech, did I truly feel what I've been wanting to feel and believe that I've been missing, which is being proud of my color. Yes, as a Christian, I know I'm loved, fearfully and wonderfully made, but I'm also human and desire to be treated no different because of the color of my skin. God blessed us with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to lead the way to help start the movement of equality on earth.
With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day.
Just because I don't believe or agree doesn't mean I can't learn from you.
Why did you have to bring that up?
Okay, that one I'm super embarrassed about.
Do you like me?
Do I like you?
Yeah.
As an individual or as a podcast?
Just as a person.
No, I like you.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
And I don't have any interest in appearing to be stronger than I am.
I ain't bow to Nebuchadnezzar's statue. He gonna lead. You feel me?
How do we love people who see the world differently than we do?
What would it look like if we truly loved all of our neighbors? Could listening to their stories be the first step? This is Seacoast Church, and there's way more to talk about.
My name is Josh Hall. I'm a part of the Seacoast family, and I'm Black. Every year, we take time to remember Martin Luther King, and every year, I think about how difficult it must have been for him to set aside all the things he wanted to do personally to keep pushing forward with a bigger goal and a bigger mission. Now that I'm older, married, with kids, I do tend to look back at him and realize that what he was doing wasn't all for naught. It wasn't all sacrifices, and he didn't give up everything. He made decisions based off of what he felt like would be best for all of those around him, when in actuality, it may seem selfless, it was actually selfish in the best ways possible. So when I look back on his life, I see a very complicated man, a very complex man, but also somebody who served, somebody who was a great example of what it means to do the best thing even when it's hard. Somebody that I'm grateful that came before me so I can look back at their life whenever I'm going through rough patches.
I'm Brenna Robinson, and I'm a part of the Seacoast church family, and I'm Black. This is what Martin Luther King Jr. means to me. His influence and ability to bring people together for a common purpose was second to none. He embodied what it means to have faith for something you may not live to see come to fruition. He is an inspiration to me because he followed the path God set before him, and in the midst of the chaos, racism, and even death threats, he still believed that we could live in a world free from all of that. That is a strength I will always admire. He had a dream that the Lord placed inside of his heart, and I am confident that we will live to see that dream come to pass.
My name is Tamilis Copeland. I'm the campus pastor here at Seacoast in North Charleston, and I'm Black. When I think of Martin Luther King Jr., I think of the word perseverance. The things that he went through so that I could have the same rights as the next person are crazy. From the sit-ins and people just talking all kind of reckless to him and throwing food at him, to the firemen and cops harassing them, turning the water hoses on them when they were trying to protest, to the marches on Washington. There's so many sacrifices that he made that I just want to say thank you for. I would not be able to be in this position that I have right now if it weren't for him. He's a hero in my book. He's proof that no matter who you are, if you allow God, he can use you to do great things.
Oh, goodness. Josh, I think it would be a pretty good decision. You're the guy that leads this church, and I think it'd be really good for you to open us up with why are we having this conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm honored to do that, and I'm grateful for you guys sitting around the table with me. Lynne and Joel both are people who I admire. Their leadership of our church have gifts and talents, and they're obvious to everybody who has sat under their teaching or experienced their leadership. I believe this is going to air on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Is that right? Yeah. I have felt for a long time that it is important for the church. I think it's important that we talk about things that the Bible talked about. I think it's important that we talk about things that are relevant in our culture. And the idea of race is something that you can't read the Bible and not see it, especially in the New Testament, where Jesus came and what he did was he was a bridge that brought all kinds of different people from all kinds of different backgrounds together. Acts 15 is a great example of like the church wrestling with issues of how do we have community when people are coming from different perspectives and different backgrounds religiously, and what does it mean to be a Christ follower and all of that stuff. And so I want to have conversations on this podcast that are important and that maybe we wouldn't have time on a weekend to give justice to. If we're going to talk about race, which I think we should, that we talk about it with our team, with our leaders and people that I admire and respect. And so often these issues come to the surface when there's some major news story, an injustice that happened around race that forces it to the surface. And then we're having conversations that, again, are important to have, but there's a lot of emotion and there's a lot of media that's talking about it and channeling it. And at the time that we're recording this, we're not in one of those situations where the news is being dominated by a story. And so I just think it's important for us to have a conversation with people that we love. And I'm excited about the conversation. I think Joey's excited about the conversation, but we had a pregame meeting. Lynne and Joel, less excited about the conversation. Why is this challenging? Why is this difficult for you guys?
Because of emotion. The emotion around race is always there because it's my lived experience on the daily. Having a conversation where I'm tempering my emotions taking control, that's not exciting to me. And it's funny because I do like lead our diversity and inclusion team, so you think like talking about this would be the thing that I like to do. But I feel like it's a thing that in instances I'm called to, but it's not something that I love to talk about. And also just being in a place where I believe God's planted me. Like I can look back over the last 10 years of being on staff at Seacoast and see God's hand in every step and that he ordained this time and this location. Just thinking about the people that I interact with or thinking about the people who will hear this that don't know me and are not going to interact with me. You know, the challenge of hearing a soundbite but not being able to sit in a room with someone, which is what I think leads to change in the world, which leads to change relationally and systemically, is being able to hear someone else's perspective. And I think that that's harder to do when you're just hearing something, a soundbite, and you don't know the person, you don't know their heart, and you're not going to reach out and say, hey, I'd love to grab lunch with you and hear more.
This isn't a moment that you're relishing in. Like no, this isn't like exciting times for Lynne.
Knots right now as we speak.
I like awkward conversations, so part of me is really excited about it, but then I also have a real level of fear because I'm attempting, and potentially even in vain, to put language to my lived experience. When I was growing up, born in San Diego, California, and San Diego's a melting pot. At the age of 10, we moved to Hilton Head Island, South Carolina, and all of a sudden, I became the only black kid in an all-white private school. The tensions of that are some things I'm still wrestling with today. Positive experience and then some difficult things. And I have the opportunity to serve at Mount Pleasant, an amazing campus. I love what I get to do. Some of the most amazing people I've ever met in my life. But then also I do that as a 6'2" black man, and the things that are said and situations that I navigate, it's just a real thing. It's something that God's uniquely built me to carry and lead. But what makes these conversations difficult, like Lynne said, is I want to look someone in the eyes and I want them to see the compassion in my heart, and I want to decouple the sound bites they may have heard from news stations and social media. And I'm so concerned about if I say a phrase that now all of a sudden who I am gets hitched to a wagon that I'm not even connected to. So I'm excited about today, but then I also know that there's a weight to it. And so I'll say this right here, right now. I don't care where you're listening to this from. if you ever want to reach out to me, just slide in my DMs on Instagram. And I really want to have conversations about this because I do think that this is the way we change the world.
And I would just say thank you guys for being honest about that. And our goal today is to have a conversation looking each other in the eyes, and people will be able to listen into that. And so thanks for being brave and having the conversation. And just so you guys know that are listening, we don't sit around at Seacoast and talk about race all the time. We have a really increasingly diverse team, and we do have conversations from time to time, and they're awesome and they're helpful. And I've learned so much, way more from the people sitting at this table and others that we've had tables like this than I have on the news, than I have on the internet. And so I'm grateful. I think that's why I'm excited, because they've really helped me. They've really helped me to do exactly what you're talking about, the opposite of what you're talking about, which is to pull away from the sound bites and build relationship and understand perspective that I didn't have. Thanks for having the courage to do it. We'll edit like crazy if we have to.
You know, we talked a little bit about this with Naeem last week, and it feels like people in general, I mean, not just Christians, but people, we don't know how to have conversations about things that we already feel very convinced of. It's like, if you don't feel the same way I do about this important issue, I don't even want to talk to you. I think what is very heavy on my heart, that is pretty much characterizing many people in the church also. I was thinking about racism and racial reconciliation, systemic racism, and all of that. It burdens me that you can't get any more simple than love your enemies. I mean, that's like the extreme. Hey, people that have harmed you, wronged you, still love them. So back that up. And I mean, because people that disagree with you on certain issues, they're not your enemies. You know, Jesus says, love your enemies, and we're not even going to listen to someone with a different perspective. Why is this topic something that if someone doesn't agree, like I've heard people say, systemic racism is not a thing. This is 2023. You're entitled to that opinion. Why is it so offensive to hear a different perspective? Why is it so?
So can I jump in? And this will be my commitment. The last question I'm going to answer first on a conversation around race. But I do think...
Well, you do have a race. You're white.
Yeah, I think we all should be able to contribute. But I believe there is a spirit of division in our country right now and in our churches that is active and that is real, and it doesn't matter what the conversation is, certainly around race, but obviously around politics, around lots of different education, around lots of different issues. I believe the enemy is trying to divide. The number one thing that Jesus said to the church, to his disciples, and John, as before he was leaving, was, man, protect the unity. Love each other as my Father, and be one as we're one, right? And I really believe that there is an active spirit that is fighting against what we're called to, which is unity. I'd love to get deeper into the issues and all of that, but I do think that if you're listening and your gut reaction, which it is mine sometimes, to just have this visceral disagreement and I want to cancel you or whatever it is, I deal with that sometimes on areas that I'm passionate about that I disagree on. Just know that when I act on that, I'm participating with the enemy in this spirit of division. Having that as a framework for me helps me to just kind of catch myself to go, wait a minute, this reaction may be spiritually, I may be participating with the division that the enemy is causing, and I don't want to be about that. I want to build unity in the church, not uniformity, not agreement on all the issues, but I want us to be unified. I'll stop talking. The white guy's going to step back and let you guys jump in and answer.
No, I think what you just said there is really insightful. One of the reasons why people don't want to have the conversation is because we're all trying to find ways not to get canceled. Our culture seems to push a narrative of the extremes. And so we don't know how to do nuance. We don't know how to do I disagree and here's why, because controversy sells. And there's no middle ground that's celebrated that says, hey, I disagree with you, here's why, and then we can walk all way hand in hand. In the absence of that, people then go back to their echo chambers where it's safe, and then that's where we speak now. So we speak loudly amongst those who agree with us, but then those who disagree, they're deemed the enemy.
And comfort, right? Especially this day and age, everything is comfortable and you don't have to do hard things. And so this conversation is hard on on all sides. It's not I just said both sides, but in the, southern United States, it tends to be black and white, but it's not. It's all sides. It's not comfortable, and people don't want to do things that aren't comfortable, especially if there's no resolution. And the resolution is a long haul. The resolution is being in relationship and long term, and having to sit down and hear someone who says something that their experience is something that you've never experienced, so it's hard to believe, and wrestling with that, like, what does that mean for me? Because if you hear it, you might have to change. Or if you say it, like, your experience may not be the thing that it like, chalk it up to, even as I was saying, like, is this because I'm black or is this because of this other thing? Like, there are probably instances where I labeled someone, they were saying or doing something to me because I was black that they may not have been because of that. And so on all sides, you come to the table with the openness that you could be wrong about some things, and that doesn't feel good. You might walk away from the table and there's not a neat little bow on it, and that doesn't feel good. And I think that our culture does not celebrate the fact that we actually just live in tension.
Also, racism is something that is not overt anymore. And so we live in a day and age where my kids, we go to the South Carolina Aquarium all the time and we love it. But the South Carolina Aquarium overlooks literally the Middle Passage, where 48% of black slaves came through America. But it almost feels like that doesn't exist anymore. Racism isn't segregated bathrooms anymore. It's not necessarily written, but it's something that lives in the unseen. What Lynne just said was like, it's like this little mind game you play. It's like, was that it? Or is that just something else?
Joel, I'll ask you this. The times, because Lynne and I have talked about this a lot, the times that Lynne has been asked to publicly share her experience, we all know, regardless of who's on stage and whatever they're talking about, there's going to be people that agree and disagree. But not only were people disagreeing with what Lynne was saying, but they felt offended enough to reach out to her and tell her. And we love all those people. Like, what is it that makes them say, I've got to defend something and reach out to her?
Right. I think every people group can feel like they're unheard. I have some friends who are white men in their late 50s, early 60s, and their perspective is, hey, the white male in America is the most hated demographic, that minorities are exalted. And then you look at the minority experience and we say, yeah, that may be done for clout, for the PR, but this is my experience. When anytime someone feels like they are a part of a group that feels disenfranchised, that brings out the fight or flight in everyone. So they either run from the situation or they go guns blazing, because I think we all want to be heard, respected, and loved.
I think that's phenomenal, because you're right. I mean, I've had conversations with Miles, like, even being a white teenage boy, they have unique challenges, just like every other demographic has. And I'm like, hey, you got to be careful with how you interact with the girls. And I'm doing that because I want to raise him to be a respectable young man, right? But I'm also like, dude, you make a wrong move, you could be the next news story. Again, I'm not asking for sympathy for that. I'm just saying, I think we all have our own lived experience. And I know for me, I was always tempted to, when we would talk about even some of the systemic stuff, I'd be like, listen, man, my family, we grew up, my dad was the pastor of a church, Freeport, Illinois, 13 people. When we got there, it grew to 19. I think it was the biggest growth spurt that church had ever had. And I remember we were helping him move a couple of years ago, and we found all of his old tax returns. And he literally, family income, we had a family of 6, his gross income was $9,500. And so we grew up without resources. We grew up and so I used to have this like, well, wait a minute, we grew up poor. We grew up with, through just some great conversations and listening, what I've come to understand is, okay, yes, that is my lived experience. We didn't have to fight a lot of the same battles that other people had to fight. And it doesn't mean our experience was invalid, or that, man, the fact that we had more milk than we knew what to do with it because we qualified for that much to be dropped off by the WIC program. But I think because I grew up poor, I wanted to be like, well, wait a minute. Maybe you grew up poor, doesn't we all? It's a level playing field, and it's really, I've realized it's not. And so anyways, I just think that your perspective is good because, I mean, we all want to defend our perspective, our experience. Talk about the 60-something-year-old white male. It can feel like the country looks a lot different than it did when they grew up. Sometimes that creates fear. And
I agree. And I've actually told my two sons, hey, you guys aren't bad for being little white boys. But I do think that as a white male, there's a limitation to my angst because my lived experience is never going to touch the black man's experience, throughout history. And I think we would all agree with that. I wasn't going to bring this up, but
you are now.
Yes. I was talking to Lynne. There's a exclusive movie on Apple TV called Emancipation. Will Smith is the main character. And I had to turn it off last night. It was just too heavy because it's based on history. And I mean, we're talking going into like a slave quarters, and there's posts along the road with heads, like real human heads, and just like, I want to watch this movie, but I just can't right now. And when I turned it off, the thought that just kept cycling in my head was this whole resistance of my people. And I understand the sentiments of, well, that wasn't me. That was ancestors. So I'm watching that and I'm like, how calloused of a response. I understand that your hands weren't involved in that, but do you not understand the horror of, a few generations back? And I mean, we're not even touching the civil rights movement right now. That was pretty horrible. Also, the example that I use, but it would be like if my father was drunk driving and he killed a little kid and I see the mother who's grieving and I'm like, well, that was my dad. It wasn't me. I mean, that'd be the most callous, stupidest thing to say. I will say that for the vast majority of my life, I said things like that.
I think for me, what I'm really more concerned with is the heart than what to say, because we're in an externally focused society where people are trying to figure out the right soundbite, meanwhile not changing their heart. And so this is why I love having these conversations in the context of community, because I'd rather have someone say the wrong thing and then let's process where their heart's at than actually trying to figure out, well, what's the right thing I say? Mm-hmm. And so sometimes when we get in these conversations about race, I think everyone's trying to figure out, well, what do I say? Mm-hmm. Do I call someone African American or black? Well, I hear the vitriol in your voice if you call me African American or black. That's what I'm talking about. I think the big thing is the heart part. So why do these conversations matter? If we don't have these conversations, we can't confront heart issues. If we don't have these conversations, then history is bound to repeat itself. If we don't have these conversations, then when our children and their children encounter different situations, we're ill-equipped to give them sage wisdom. If we don't have these conversations, then the church will no longer be a place of healing. It'll be a place that becomes irrelevant and then the world will continue to run from.
Even thinking about in any other situation outside of race, when something happens, when there's a trauma, we never tell the trauma victim that happened in the past and none of that affects you today. It would be absurd to tell someone who was abused that now they're not bound by their abuse, right? They can overcome it, they can heal from it, but in doing that, you have to address what happened in the past. And so in the conversation of race, just saying it's 2023, like why we're having the conversation is because if we don't acknowledge the past, if we don't own it, if we don't wrestle through the uncomfortableness of it, then we pretend like there's no generational effect. And there is a generational effect. Like if you go to Fort Sumter right now, you're going to see my ancestor's picture hanging up in there, Jacob Stroy, because his slave owners sent him to fight for the Confederates because that's what they would do. And so my family, you think that's my great-great-grandfather. And so you think of how he raised his kids and how they raised their kids, and everything that we're living out and experiencing is because of how things have been passed down, what we've gone through, what we've experienced.
I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. Because I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Hey Seacoast, I'm Amanda Snipe and I've been a part of the Seacoast family for about 12 years now. I'm also a 39-year-old black woman, a wife, a mom, and an educator. And I want to teach you a little bit about what Martin Luther King Jr. means to me. First, let me tell you about my mom. She was 15 years old when he was killed. And so my mom saw him, though, as a ticket to freedom, that she would be able to drink from the same fountain as those in Charleston who are white, and that she'd be able to go to the restaurant and sit at the booth rather than standing in the alleyway to wait for her food. And then she also knew people who went to marches and they were thrown in the back of paddy wagons and sent to jail. Well, it was in 1969 that schools began integration and my mom started to see white teachers coming into her school, which is interesting because I'm 39 and at that time I would have been losing my job because so many black teachers lost their jobs at that time. Also, I think about the fact that there's a whole teacher shortage right now, so I don't even think that it would matter what color a teacher is at this point. We just need teachers. But I digress. Let me tell you something. My daughter is right now in kindergarten and she's able to sit near classmates who look so different from her, so many different colors and races and languages, and it's beautiful. But I also want to remind her that we must continue to talk about what MLK Jr. believed in. Thank you so much.
I'm Derek Bellamy and I'm part of the Seacoast Church family, and I'm an African American. This is what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. meant to me. Hope. In the 8th grade, I had the opportunity to memorize a speech, and I chose Dr. King's speech. Over 30 years ago, something about those words resonated with me. Today, the proud father of 3 biracial kids, MLK, that is, Mason, Luke, and Keegan, that message of hope is alive and well. I hope and pray that they would experience a world where they're judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Hope, the great motivator and equalizer. Dr. King symbolized hope for me.
I'm Dolores, and I'm part of the Seacoast Church family, and I'm an African American. And this is what Martin Luther King Jr. means to me. Martin Luther King was a visionary. He was a dreamer. He was a champion of diversity. And because of his work in the civil rights movement, I'm able to sit in places and be in spaces that generations ago that I would not be able to do today. We all have benefited from his work. Although there is much work to do, I'm celebrating the work that's already been done and knowing that I have a responsibility to partner in the work that's to come.
My name is Carol Etheridge. I am a member of the Seacoast family, and I am African American. Here's what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. means to me. A visionary leader with a few personal traits that I hold dear: confidence, humility, and love. The confidence to interact with people from all walks of life as he worked to challenge and change the status quo and the racially discriminatory practices of his time. With all of his many accomplishments and accolades, he never lost sight of the needs and concerns of the voiceless and the underserved of our communities. And love, the kind of love that comes through even when we disagree. That kind of love that knows no bounds, that is not hindered by the barriers that we create. You know, the kind that when you walk in a room, people know that you're living in love. And when you leave, you invite everyone to go in peace. Thank you.
My dad graduated from a segregated high school in Columbia in 1971. His lived experience has every bit to do with my today. And so we are having these conversations because, like, we can't just, the movie that you just watched, those stories are passed down in families. Right. Like, my parents not liking me driving at night, there's a reason for it. It's not just because it's at night. Yeah. It's because historically it hasn't been safe for a black woman to be out by herself. So it's important to have those conversations. So when someone says, well, that was my ancestors, yeah, it was. And it was my ancestors too. And so the culture that we're living in now, we're like harvesting things that were planted then. And so the only way to change what our children are going to harvest is for us to acknowledge that and do something different today.
I think that even though we're talking about racism in the American context, this is a timeless global issue between ethnicities not being able to agree, with ethnicities not being able to live in harmony. And so I think this is not just an American experience. This is a global, reoccurring issue that will always be with us. And I think if, as believers, we can start to experience breakthrough personally with understanding those who are disenfranchised, who don't look like us, glass ceilings that may be someone's normal, and we can fight that injustice, then I think the church will continue to thrive in decades and centuries to come.
I think that if you just look at the basics of our faith in terms of the fruit of the Spirit and living out our faith, for some reason when we get into these heated conversations, or we see what comes out of us. And I think when I see myself getting really defensive about something, it's a great opportunity to stop and go, okay, what's going on inside of me? What's causing that? There is no agenda with this conversation in terms of I don't know that there's an end game goal of this is what we want, X percentage of diversity or X, it really is about stewarding the people that God's called us to lead in this church, and trying to do so in a way where we're all growing. I mean, the crosses are full every weekend at Seacoast. And if you're not a Seacoaster, we use the crosses to repent of sin. We've all are on this journey where we're going to fall short and we're going to deal with sin in our life. And the sign of mark of maturity for me is not necessarily that I don't sin anymore. It's how quick am I to repent? How quick am I to acknowledge my sin? And certainly as it relates to race, I've had to deal with my own sin when that comes up. And my heart is just that we would be honest with each other. We'd love each other. We'd repent quickly when we find ourselves in error. We would refuse the shame that maybe the culture puts on us. I feel like there are times where I felt like to acknowledge bias or a aspect of racism that I might be dealing with in my heart means that I'm a racist, and that I should, and I just think that there's so much shame around that. But I just hope that we would be quick to be honest with ourselves, and that we would listen. This was our kind of mantra. We want to listen, we want to learn, we want to love. So we want to listen to perspectives that are different. We want to learn. Sometimes that means repenting. Sometimes it's just, oh, wow, I didn't know that perspective. That's great to know and learn, and give me empathy for your story, and treat people with love. And so that's my end game goal in the conversation.
Personally, I will share that I don't consider myself really anything politically. I'm very conservative in areas, very liberal in areas, but very much so throughout my life was one way. And I'm just laying it out there. The sort of things that I'm talking about, people being defensive of and offended by, I'm talking about myself for first 35 years of my life, maybe 30. And for me personally, it was because I had my political affiliations so entangled with God's kingdom, they just seemed one and the same. When I asked you guys, what do you think people are defending? I can say from my perspective, it was defending something that didn't even exist in my head, and that was the intertwining of God's kingdom and man's kingdom. Because if we take our cues fully from either party, we're going to be misled because we're following human beings. That was just my experience.
Joel said earlier about the extremes. I think it's not even a party. It's the loudest and most shared voices, which are always going to be the extremes on each side. And so I do think that we struggle with, is this kingdom of God? Is this a political thing? Whatever. But it's. I feel like even the idea that one party has this issue right and the other doesn't. I think you can talk to people in both parties who are on a good road when it comes to wanting the same things regarding justice, regarding even reform in different areas of our country that need it. And so I think that it's the extremes that we latch onto, like you said earlier, Joel, that that doesn't represent Democrat, that doesn't represent Republican. That's just a really loud voice that's controversial enough that the news is going to continue to feed on it.
It's just interesting. I think we need to start asking ourselves the question of politics and race, in the sense of there is an assumption in our culture about politics and race. And as we continue having these conversations, we have to ask, why are we attaching the two? Because you can be conservative in some areas and liberal in some areas that don't have to do with race. Even if I lean closer to one political group. I haven't voted straight party ticket since the very first election, and after that, one of my friends challenged me on that. And so it's been like, if we're like kind of playing into this idea that like there's always controversy around it, we're not teaching people that you can value this, you can work in this tension, and you can believe these things about these different political issues, instead of just assuming we're going to run with culture and say we have to attach the issue of race to political parties, and this one's for this one and that one's for that one. Just need to ask ourselves some of those questions, because I think that perpetuates this idea that you only believe this if you're a part of this political party.
I also think, too, it's like attaching race and political discussions is a generational thing, because people are becoming more and more apolitical, that they may not have that same connection. I think for me, race and the discussions around it, it's one of those things that's taught in the home. And that's the battleground that if I ever could wage war in an area, it would be that, is how do you help shift the generational teachings of it? Because I think that's where it lays into it all.
All right, so we're going to take a turn here, and before we get into some different stuff, something was brought up, and I'm super curious. Is it even possible for churches to try to be diverse without coming across contrived? I get the heart behind, we want to see, all sorts of diversity, but is that something that you can try for? Does that make sense?
Yes, and yes. I think,
yes, there is a way of doing it.
I think to say, can you try to do something, means are you being intentional about it? I don't think you drift into kingdom life. I think you fight for it. And so how you're trying is the question. It's not a question of do we try because it's not authentic. It's like where there is no vision, where there's no revelation, that people cast off restraint. We're not going to drift into the hard things. We're not going to drift into being united. We have to try to do it. But I think the question is, how do you try? And we've seen ways of different expressions of trying that haven't felt authentic. Mm-hmm. But so the question is about how you're trying, not if you're trying.
I think it feels contrived in church because we go towards demographics, we go towards optics more than we do heart change, and we stop right there. So when the demographics get right, when the optics look good, we think we've done our job, when that's actually the start of it all. And so it stays in that middle schooler, weird-looking age where your feet are big, but you're still 5'2". It stays in that age because we're not growing to the heart change. And so I've said this to people before. It's like diversity is interesting because people may want you on the team because of the optics, but do they want you in the crew, which is in life with them, where you're actually in those intimate relationships? And I think that's where the change happens.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. All right. So next week, we're going to release an episode with hip hop and spoken word artist. And then John Mark McMillan, I always like to throw this out there, the guy that wrote He Loves Us, because I think
he wrote the Sloppy Wet Kiss.
Yeah, he wrote the Sloppy Wet Kiss. They're going to be talking about a song that they did together that's really related to what we're talking about now. And so we talked a lot about this stuff you'll hear next week.
Earlier, I talked about racism being a global issue, and the fight between ethnicities is a timeless struggle. But the tree wasn't born in America. The tree was born probably a little bit after the Garden of Eden, right? It's a timeless issue we've been struggling with, but I think that tree also exists between Sunni and Shia. Mm-hmm. It also exists between the different caste systems in India. You can go globally around Aborigines and Australians. You can see it all around the world where it's a timeless struggle.
I think that's a great perspective. Joel just helped us see that we're all part of a tree that's broken and that's divided, and to get a broader perspective to go, I'm part of a tree that, I don't know when it happened. You had Cain and Abel, who were obviously not of different races, but you had Abraham and you had Isaac and Ishmael, and it wasn't long after humanity started that we had these divisions that were built around ethnicity and, ultimately race. And so, gosh, I love that answer. That's really, really helpful.
Another theme that I would love to hear from Lynne and Joel on is Joey Svendsen, to this day, I believe that I benefit from my ancestors because they were white. I still benefit. And there's exceptions to that. Obviously, there's people that doesn't benefit them at all. And then there's black people who came from wealth. And the best example that I could come up with is my dad graduated from Clemson in '69. In that time period, there were more opportunities for white people when it came to education. So he became a civil engineer, bought a house. My parents just sold that house they bought in '71. And 3 years ago, my white grandmother passed away, and their house was in prime James Island, area, which is tons of money. And we're not talking something huge, but I'm still going to benefit from that longevity of education and land ownership. And would you guys agree that to this day in 2023, financially, opportunity-wise, like I do believe that, we could throw the phrase out, equal opportunity. Everybody can go after stuff, but I think that there's still benefit from the past or disadvantages from the past.
Yeah, I think that's really important to recognize, be aware of. I think one of the struggles with conversations of racism, it creates a collective helplessness. So what it creates for people who align themselves with the majority of Americans. So if you're white, you may feel like, well, dang, I Joey Svendsen wasn't there when my grandfather bought this house. So how do I feel guilt for something I didn't do, which is real. I think, though, taking it to the extreme of saying, and because I can't do anything about it, I have less compassion for the road that someone else is struggling. I think that's where it gets really dangerous. But I think the danger of these conversations sometimes is that collective helplessness of like, man, I know that history's weight is on my shoulders.
Well, and I would just say, isn't it like for those that are around the table that have children, isn't it our goal to create opportunities for them and to hopefully have them go further and faster and better than us? That's my goal. I know not related to race, but part of why I'm sitting in the seat that I'm sitting in right now is because my great-grandfather gave his life to Christ, and he passed down a legacy of faith to my grandpa, who still teaches a Bible study on Tuesday mornings at Mount Pleasant campus here.
Super popular with the ladies too, right?
Popular. Well, he's married now, so.
Oh, my bad.
But come on, Joey, let's not market grandpa. But so I have a legacy of faith that was directly connected to several generations before. And so, yeah, that applies financially. That applies to the opportunities that people had or didn't have. And I think that to acknowledge that part of why my family grew up in poverty is because a lot of them were in jail for generations prior because of decisions that they made. And that affected my childhood. And of course, now we've been able to be a part of the church. And my dad, he was just wise with real estate. And we got into a car accident that had insurance payments that were available to us at 18, and I got $6,000 when I turned 18. And my dad helped me to go, hey, why don't we take what you got, what your brother got? I'll chip in some, and we'll buy a house at 18. And the reason that I live in the house that I live in right now, which is nothing extravagant, but it's a great home that I'm able to raise my kids in, is because my dad helped me make a really wise decision at 18 years old, and that $6,000 turned into a lot more than that because it appreciated, and when we sold it, then we bought something else. And so anyways, that's all a very real, practical, day-to-day expression of my reality is because of decisions made from generations prior. And so I don't think it should be a hard leap to go, well, what if my grandpa didn't have the option to buy land on James Island? Well, certainly that's affecting people today. I think you can acknowledge that without hating our country, without thinking that we're all evil, without thinking that we haven't made progress. Like, I think that's another part of the conversation. It's like, it's okay to acknowledge that there's been lots of progress made, but that it doesn't mean that we've arrived at a place where everybody has the same opportunities.
I think it's also interesting in answering that question. Someone may struggle, like if you have a white male who grew up poor, who didn't have an investment, and would say, well, Joey, you're benefiting from something that my family doesn't benefit from either. I think for some people it's hard to say yes to that because their lived experience is they're in the same boat, and it's not because they were a different race. It's just because they were poor. And so how do you grapple with the answer could be yes, And also there are other people who are living in poverty or who have generational poverty. And so I think that where we get in trouble when we're having these conversations about race is that there are a lot of problems in our society. There are a lot of things for us to overcome. There are a lot of injustices. And just because one is true doesn't mean that the other isn't true as well. And so it's kind of a both and. Like you look and you see this generational poverty. You see these generational challenges with education and the ability to buy property in certain areas of town, this inability to use your GI Bill because there aren't as many colleges that you can go to, right? And so you see that this is true, and you look at the statistics of minorities and you see like, yeah, this is happening. And also, we know that certain things are true for all people who are living in poverty. I would say yes, I do think that there is, and I can tell you my family history and tell you, what we've been able to do and haven't been able to do over the generations. But I think in answering that, some people struggle to engage with the conversation because their lived experience as a non-minority feels the same.
My eldest daughter, her name is Alexandria, and Alexandria means defender of mankind, and it was inspired from this verse in Proverbs 31 that says, "Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and the needy." And so let's pull this conversation to 2023, and wherever you're at in the spectrum, I think as Christians, we have this responsibility to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. My wish with this conversation of the historical disparities is, okay, well, in 2023, how can you pull someone to a table that they wouldn't be invited to? And so I think we can legislate away affirmative action and equal opportunities, but when you can give someone a seat at the table that's invite only is a game changer. And so 3 weeks ago, I had a successful, struggling African-American businessman meet with a successful white one. They both come to the same church, have been coming for decades, but they've run in parallel worlds but never intersected. When they met each other, it was just like this thing because of Jesus, and now they're able to help each other in the business world because they both can see each other's worth and value. And I think for me in my life is all I want is to be able to have a seat at the table where I have a shot. That's something that the government is ill-equipped to legislate away. Yeah, you can put demographics and quotas and all that kind of stuff, but that may get you the foot in the door. But the real opportunities in America are the ones that are invite only.
So you mean to tell me that Christians are supposed to be known for love, generosity, and sacrifice?
Crazy, yes. Yes. Christians are supposed to be known for something. More than just what you do on Sunday morning, yes.
Josh, did you know that?
I did.
I want to ask, we're closing this thing up, but obviously with today being Martin Luther King Day, what does Martin Luther King mean to you guys personally, Lynne and Joel?
For me, what I see when I think about the life of Dr. Martin Luther King and then my responsibility for his sacrifice today, I think about someone who's willing to go against comfort, what could have meant his upward mobility. He rejected a few jobs that were comfortable to move down to the South to fight what I'm a beneficiary of today. He put himself on the road to fight something that was uncomfortable. And so for me, right before I had the opportunity to come into Seacoast, I had this great opportunity in Dallas, Texas. It was a church that was highly diverse. It was going to be comfortable. Everyone looked like me and my kids. My wife is porcelain. My kids look like they're in the middle of it all. They're all mixed up. And when we walked in this church, everyone was like me. And it felt so comfortable. And a friend of mine asked me, he's like, "Hey, are you called to comfort? Or are you called to something that would actually build bridges?" I'm on a call of God on my life to build bridges in places that others may not be able to. Martin Luther King Day is a day where I want to stop and reflect and realize it's a part of American history. To put it as Black history is underserving it to a certain degree because all of us as Americans, no matter race, creed, whatever, we should celebrate a day where an American fought for something that makes all of America better.
Yeah.
And so that's for me what the day means, and we still got to fight for it.
Yeah, for me, Dr. King means that I can do hard things. Like, I look back at, and saying my parents' generation and my grandparents' generation, we see the photos and they're in black and white, so we feel like they were a long time ago, but they weren't. And just to think how drastically different my life is because people did hard things. Like, I can drive in the middle of the night up to visit a friend and not feel the same fear that my grandmother felt if she were to have done something like that. So thinking about Dr. King, I think about him and him being the face of thousands of people who were doing that. You know, we live in Charleston, and so all of us drive over Septima Clark Parkway, you know, and like, she's one of those freedom fighters, right? That changed the world for us. And so I think about him, and I think about all the men and women that like did really hard things by the power of the Holy Spirit, because you can't tell me that somebody sits at a lunch counter and gets spit on and hit and beat and doesn't respond back in violence without Holy Spirit guiding them. And so it just challenges me for a better future, but also like God was in it. Looking at him, looking at the men and women that have gone before me, just reminding me like I can do hard things because God has paved the way and he did it with them. He's going to do it with us. So
that's beautiful. I'm grateful for the day for the same reasons that you guys are, but from a different perspective. I feel like the way that he led was with passion and conviction, but he also seemed to have this like divine wisdom to do it in a way that brought along as many people as possible. Obviously, he faced a lot of challenges, and there are a lot of different activists in his day, but his nonviolent approach, I think, made him accessible to a lot of people that look like me that got in the conversation during that day that maybe wouldn't have without just the unique giftings that Martin Luther King had. And my kids are growing up in a much different reality. Feels more hopeful that a day is coming, maybe even that we'll be able to see where our kids aren't having to deal with the same challenges that the generations did before. So.
As long as the world has hate in it, there's more work to be done.
As long as the world has hate in it, there's more work to be done.
As long as the world has hate in it, there's more work to be done.
As long as the world has hate in it, there's more work to be done.
As long as there is heat in this world, there is more work to be done. As long as the world has hate in it, there's more work to be done.
Thanks for listening. There's a link in the show notes to our podcast Facebook page where we talk about these episodes and share some behind-the-scenes information, including guests we're booking. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode.